When you think of a Roman legionnaire, you probably picture gleaming armor and disciplined formations marching to victory. But the reality was that most new recruits didn't survive their first brutal month of training, and those who did faced horrors that would break a modern person in days. Roman military discipline wasn't just strict, it was designed to strip away every shred of your humanity and rebuild you into a killing machine through methods so extreme they were considered torture even by ancient standards. Tonight, we'll walk through your first week as a fresh recruit, from the moment you take the oath that legally makes you the property of Rome. And by the end, you'll discover the one punishment so terrifying that hardened veterans would literally fall on their own swords rather than face it. So get comfortable and prepare to experience 7 days that would either forge you into one of history's most feared warriors or destroy you completely. Before the training even began, the process of selection was itself a trial. The Roman army was not a place for the frail or the faint of heart. Recruiters were sent out to find suitable men, and their criteria were strict. They looked for young men, ideally between the ages of 18 and 20, who possessed a strong physical build. They checked their height, their eyesight, and their general health. A potential recruit needed to be at least 5 Roman feet and 10 inches tall, a standard that ensured uniformity in the fighting line. They looked for clear eyes, broad shoulders, and strong legs, the raw material of a soldier. But physical health was only the beginning. The recruiters were also searching for a certain character. They looked for men from rural backgrounds, farmers and laborers who were already accustomed to a life of hard physical work. At the very beginning of this journey, before the real hardship began, the recruit had to perform a solemn act. He had to take the sacramentum, the military oath. This was not a simple pledge of allegiance. It was a sacred and binding ritual. Standing before his new centurion and the legion's standards, the recruit would swear his loyalty. He would vow to obey his commanders without question, to never desert the army, and to be ready to sacrifice his life for the Roman state. This oath was the point of no return. By speaking these words, the recruit ceased to be a private citizen. He became, in a very real sense, the property of Rome. His life was no longer his own. The oath transformed him from a free man into an instrument of the state. This psychological shift was profound, severing the ties to his old life, to his family and his home. The first day of training began before the sun had even touched the horizon. The recruits were roused from a restless sleep in their shared tents, the air cold and damp. There was no gentle awakening. The first order of the day was not breakfast, but a grueling run. This was not a short jog. It was a long, punishing ordeal designed to test their stamina and push them to their physical limits from the very first moment. After the run, the real work began. The recruits were introduced to the tools of their new trade, but not the glamorous sword and shield. Instead, they were handed wooden training swords, wicker shields, and heavy wooden poles. These training tools were deliberately made to be twice the weight of the real equipment. The afternoon was dedicated to what the Romans called the work. This meant hard, manual labor. The army was not just a fighting force, it was a mobile engineering corps. Every legionary had to be an expert in construction. The dawn of the second day brought no relief. The aches from the day before had settled deep into their bones, a constant throbbing reminder of their new reality. The pre-dawn run felt even longer, their legs heavy as lead. The focus of these days shifted towards carrying the immense weight of a legionary's full pack. The recruits were loaded up with their marching gear, which could weigh over 60 pounds. This included their armor, their shield, a pack with personal items, entrenching tools, and several days' worth of rations. They were then forced to march. Not a gentle stroll, but a paced, disciplined march over miles of uneven terrain. This was the Iustum Iter, the standard day's march, a distance of about 20 miles, which had to be completed in 5 hours during the summer. This was a lesson in endurance. The constant marching chafed their skin raw and sent jolts of pain through their feet with every step. It taught the recruits to push past their perceived limits, to keep moving even when every fiber of their being screamed for them to stop. Having endured the initial physical breaking, the recruits were now deemed ready to learn the true art of Roman combat. The focus shifted from pure conditioning to tactical training. The wooden swords and wicker shields were still in use, but the drills became more complex. They moved from individual practice to partner drills, learning the fundamental rhythm of Roman fighting, the block with the shield, the quick stab with the sword. The centurions emphasized that the gladius was a stabbing weapon, not a slashing one. But the most important lesson of these days was learning to move as one. They were introduced to basic formation drills. They learned to form a line, to march in step, and to maintain their spacing perfectly. They practiced wheeling, advancing, and retreating as a single, solid block. This was the foundation of the legion's strength. A single legionary was vulnerable, but 100 legionaries moving as one, their shields interlocked, were an almost unstoppable force. The sixth day was a culmination of everything they had learned and endured so far. It was the day of the full-scale practice march. This was not just a 20-mile hike. It was a simulation of a legion on the move in hostile territory. After marching for hours, they would be halted in an open field, a place with no natural defenses. Then came the command to make camp. This was the true test. Exhausted, dehydrated, and aching from the march, they now had to construct a fully fortified marching camp from scratch. As the sun began to set, the camp would be finished. A perfect temporary fortress stood where there had been only an empty field hours before, but there was no rest to be had inside it. After a brief inspection by the officers, the command would be given to tear it all down. Then, in the growing darkness, they would march all the way back to the main training camp. This final act was a lesson in obedience and the transient nature of their work. The morning of the seventh day was different. There was a strange quiet in the air. The brutal routine was paused. The recruits, nursing their sore muscles and their battered spirits, were allowed a period of relative rest. This was a day for maintenance and inspection. Later in the day, the recruits were assembled. They were no longer the disorganized, nervous crowd that had arrived a week earlier. They stood straighter. Their movements were more economical. The softness was gone, burned away by the relentless training. They had survived. They had endured the runs, the marches, the beatings, and the crushing labor. They had learned to obey, to work as a team, and to push themselves far beyond what they thought was possible. They were not yet legionaries, but they were no longer simply Tyrones. The fundamental transformation had occurred. They had accepted their place in the machine. The week ended not with a celebration, but with a quiet understanding. The forging was complete. Discipline was the bedrock of the Roman army, and it was enforced through a system of punishments that were both swift and severe. But there was one punishment that stood above all others, a spectre that haunted the nightmares of even the most hardened and decorated veterans. It was called decimatio, or decimation. When a unit was sentenced to decimation, the cohort was divided into groups of 10. Each group of 10 soldiers was then forced to draw lots. The one unlucky soldier upon whom the lot fell was to be executed. The other 9 men in his group, his friends and comrades with whom he had fought and bled, were then forced to carry out the sentence. This was a horror on multiple levels. It was a random death sentence, where bravery or guilt meant nothing. It was also a profound betrayal, forcing soldiers to become the executioners of their own shield brothers. Even veterans who had faced down fearsome enemies on countless battlefields were terrified of decimation. It was the final brutal proof that a Roman soldier was not a man, but a tool, and any tool could be discarded for the sake of the machine. This was the ultimate fear that kept the legions in line, the dark heart of Roman discipline. The gleaming armor and perfect formations that we admire today were forged not just through training and courage, but through a system of control so absolute and terrifying that it could turn brother against brother in service to the state. And now you know why you couldn't survive 1 week as a Roman soldier. Sleep well, knowing that such trials are behind us, lost to history, but never forgotten.